Brake dust is a common sight in Formula 1. Those clouds of black dust that explode from the wheels when a driver is braking heavily for a corner or pulling into the pit box are part and parcel of Grand Prix racing. But should they be? That's a question that 4 times world champion Sebastian Vettel raised earlier this year when he complained about breathing in carbon dust which was visible on his face and fireproofs, and describing it as not that healthy. He attributed this to the rule changes for 2022, specifically the brake duct geometry that in his case directs the brake dust at the driver. This is also exacerbated by the return of wheel covers in F1 for the first time since 2009. So does Vettel have a point? Is this really a new problem, and what could F1 do to tackle it? Brake dust has always been around in Formula 1. Even in the early days, when drum brakes were de rigueur, dust did build up, but was usually contained within the drum. But disc brakes soon took over, having been pioneered in F1 by BRM. In the mid-1970s, Brabham started to experiment with carbon in its brake discs. These weren't the carbon brakes we know of today, but were instead small carbon fibre pucks recessed into the discs. It wasn't until the 1980s that fully carbon-to-carbon brakes were in widespread use, and that meant there was plenty of carbon brake dust flying around. And there still is today, because it's the inevitable consequence of the brake material being ground away by friction. And as former Ferrari F1 driver Mika Salo, who started 109 F1 races from 1994 to 2002, explained on an episode of F1's Beyond the Grid podcast in 2020, it gets into the lungs of drivers. After he retired from Formula 1, Salo required an operation to remove part of his lung that had been damaged in a Japanese F3000 crash before he raced in F1. He was told that his lungs were completely black, with a substance responsible identified as carbon. We'll come back to Salo's suggestion it was fine in a moment, but it's easy to see why this problem has come onto the radar now. The wheel covers, which are a standard supply part so everyone has the same design and can't change it, makes it more difficult for the brake dust to be expelled to the outside of the car. This means it's more likely to be directed at the driver. But it varies from car to car, with the Aston Martin and the Alpine among those reckoned to have a problem with this. It will be down to a combination of the geometry of the brake ducts, and also the wider aero characteristics of the car, given everyone has its own unique characteristics that will influence the trajectory of the brake dust. That's why world champion Max Verstappen said he had no problems with it when he was asked by the race about brake dust ingestion. He suggested it depended on the design of the brake drums. George Russell, a director of the Grand Prix Drivers Association that lobbies for drivers' safety, said he also didn't have problems, but the Mercedes driver stressed that it's down to the FIA to ensure that this is not a health risk for drivers. Valtteri Bottas is another who has talked about this in the past. In 2019, he said that he often sneezes out brake dust, and said that this was less to do with brake dust from his own car and more as a result of it being shed by other cars on track. What's clear is there's plenty of brake dust being put into the environment and therefore breathed in, and not only by drivers. Let's get back to Mika Salo's comment that brake dust is harmless. Is that really the case? Setting aside the fact that accumulating any particles of this type in your lungs is clearly not a good thing, what do we know about the effect this can have on the human body? It's well known that sustained ingestion of carbon can lead to pneumoconiosis. Commonly known as something suffered by coal miners, it's an occupational lung disease, but one that requires long-term, intensive exposure. F1 drivers aren't having to work in those kinds of conditions, so it would be exaggerating to suggest that's the potential consequence. But any build-up of tiny particles will have an effect, whether it's on lung capacity or even some of the other potential negative health impacts. Carbon fibre is still a relatively new material, certainly in terms of its more widespread use, so the research into this isn't definitive, but there's plenty of evidence that it's worth keeping out of your lungs. And there's a big body of evidence that says particle emissions in general can have a plethora of health risks in all sorts of parts of the body. What's more, amid the push to eliminate harmful emissions from both road and racing cars in general, with air pollution causing an estimated 307,000 deaths in Europe every year, it's important not to focus solely on tailpipe emissions. Indeed, research indicates around 20% of the fine particulate matter pollution caused by cars is from brake dust. Yet there have been no serious attempts to contain this by regulation, be it for the road or motorsport. While tailpipe emissions have been reduced by measures such as cleaner fuels and filtration and increasing electrification, brake dust continues simply to be thrown out into the environment. Given the health impacts of fine particulate matter pollution in general, this is an obvious area to tackle. The FIA is looking into tweaks to the geometry of the brake ducts to ensure brake dust is not directed at the driver, which is a sensible move, but containment is not on the agenda. That means brake dust pollution will remain part of Formula 1, it just won't be getting blown directly into the drivers' faces quite so much in the future. Now, the sum total of brake dust emissions from Grand Prix cars over a whole season of running is barely even a drop in the ocean, but given F1 has made much of its environmental objectives, including its net zero carbon 2030 target, you can make a strong case that it should be turning its attention to particle emissions from the brakes as the next stage in ensuring it minimises its environmental impact. What if there were a way to prevent 90% of these fine brake dust particles escaping into the environment? Technology does exist that could potentially be adapted for use in F1 and other racing categories to slash the amount of brake dust being released. That brings us to Tamic. Produced by French company Tallano Technologies, this is an ingenious system that uses a small turbine activated under braking to extract the brake dust as it's generated. This is assisted by small modifications to the material used in the brake calipers. For the road car version, this is operated by an independent electronic control unit, but there's no reason why an F1 specific version couldn't be operated by the standard ECU. The turbine is connected to the brakes by pipework, which effectively sucks the dust produced by brake abrasion and then captures it in a filter. The technology works well for road cars and even trains and buses. It would have to be adapted for the extreme conditions of an F1 car and would need to be even more tightly packaged with weight minimised, but that could be done. F1 has at times been something of a follower when it comes to minimising its environmental impact. Well, here's a way that it could look to not only further clean up its own act, but also raise awareness of the issues of brake particle pollution on the road. That would be technological leadership befitting of F1's desire to be road relevant and would get it ahead in an area that, sooner or later, is going to be regulated. With new car regulations planned for 2026 to coincide with the next generation power unit regulations, which will also bring sustainable synthetic fuels to Grand Prix racing, how about it, F1?